Good morning. As Dave said, my name's Andy Rohn. I'm the Vice President of Recruitment Process Outsourcing for Yo, and I have the pleasure of introducing Rebecca Costa. Title of her presentation is Future Think, From Data Intelligence to Artificial Intelligence. And so as organizations struggle to get their hands around amorphous big data and analytics, few stop to wonder where all this data is ultimately leading. Thought leader and sociobiologist Rebecca Costa will discuss why all this data matters and what are the ramifications to businesses and individuals. More importantly, she'll talk about where all this data is leading to, what comes after analytics. In her talk, you'll also discover the coming technologies that will change the nature of talent acquisition. The keynote is a blend of future think and tactical steps for the talent acquisition professional to succeed in an increasingly complex world. Rebecca is a sociobiologist and author who offers an evolutionary explanation for current events and emerging trends. A new voice in the mold of Alan Toffler, Thomas Friedman, and Malcolm Gladwell, Costa attributes modern consternation from terrorism, crime on Wall Street, epidemic obesity, and upheaval in the Middle East to genetic imperatives. Retiring from a career in Silicon Valley, Rebecca spent 6 years researching and writing The Watchman's Rattle, a radical new theory of collapse. The success of this book in 25 countries led to a weekly nationally syndicated radio news program called The Costa Report. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Costa.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah, in the back? Wave if you can hear. Okay, very good. We're going to have some fun this morning. We're going to actually look at the big picture. And by big picture, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. And that means going back to single-celled organisms to our current plight today. And we're facing some biological challenges as we move from complexity to simplicity. And we want to talk about how we can overcome and meet those challenges. I am a sociobiologist, as you heard from training, and my area of expertise is fast adaptation in fast-changing environments. And it doesn't matter if that's occurring in nature or it's happening in business. Think of all of your companies and the industries that you're in as just simply being ecosystems. And right now, the changing environment is a massive amount of complexity that's hitting us very, very quickly. By just a show of hands, and I'm going to ask you to be really, have a moment of truth and honesty here. How many people have noticed just in the last 3 or 5 years that things have gotten a lot more complicated? Raise your hand. Okay, now keep your hand up, and I want you to look around the room. It is not you. It is not you. For a while, my son was trying to convince me that it was just that I was getting older. He goes, that's part of the aging process, Mom. And then we happened to be walking through a hotel, and we got in the elevator, and there was a gal that was about 18, and she looked over at him, and she said she had a smartphone in her hand. He said, don't call it a smartphone, Mom, call it a phone. We don't have smartphones. And she looked over at him, and she said, can you tell me how to turn the music off on this? And I said, it's not me. It's not an age thing. We're going through something right now. If you think about complexity, it is growing in picoseconds. According to Eric Schmidt, he says that we are generating as much information. Eric Schmidt was a CEO of Google. We're generating as much information every 48 hours as we did from the dawn of humankind to year 2003. So that means you go home on a Friday, and that body of information and scientific data has been recreated by Monday morning. Does anybody know what this is? This is the chart that General McChrystal put up before the American people and said, when we understand this, we win the campaign in Afghanistan. I happen to be in the press room at the moment, and all of the press people put our pens down, and we said, oh no, that's not very good. This is actually the immigration roadmap that's being proposed in Congress. This is the Affordable Care Act. This is how you process it. We're laughing, but I had to work really hard to find a diagram that would fit on one slide, actually. The Affordable Care Act is about 260,000 words. The entire US energy bill that we are operating on is only 157,000 words. So you can see it's exponentiating. By the way, this is a rec for a small company, not one of your companies, a small company on how to requisition a new hire. And this is a CEO for a robotics company, their job description. And by the way, what's really interesting about this is you had to click on each one of these, and there was like another diagram associated with each box. If we can't even understand the diagrams that we're putting together, and by the way, these aren't that unusual. You can go search complex diagrams on Google, and there's a whole bunch come up with arrows everywhere. It's not that unusual that I would go to a meeting of the Association of University Presidents and Chancellors, and they would say to me, I don't even know the questions to ask to make the right hire. I have to hire a CIO to take care of my campus network, and I don't know how to do it. And the reason is very simple. It has to do with the velocity of data that's coming at us, the volume, the variety. 99% of the data that you're expected to take into consideration in doing hiring, which you just heard about from Rob, is what we call unstructured data. Now, what does unstructured data mean? It means not usable. That's what it means. It means uncontrollable. It's things like emails. It's conversations people have back and forth. It's meetings that don't get recorded and aren't videotaped. It's things like audio files that can't be searched on search engine optimization programs. And then the veracity of the data. For every study that you find on the internet that says one thing, you can find, how many have that problem? You find one study and then you go and you find 10 others that contradict? Does that sound familiar? But biological change, this spacesuit that we're dealing with every day that President Obama lives in and you and I live in, it takes millions of years to develop new capabilities. Right now, driving in my car, I could use a couple of extra hands. I mean, I don't know how to drive, operate my nav system, take a phone call. You know, there's a lot of things I want to do in my car, and they keep adding new features to the dashboard. I don't have enough appendages. Now, we have to get real at some point. Obviously, we're not accepting any biological limitations, and we know that because they had to make a law to tell us that we can't text and drive a 2-ton vehicle. Really? If we can't figure out what the limits of the human organism are, then we're going to have the government tell us. And I know there's a lot of people like me in the audience that are saying, well, I prefer the government doesn't tell us. Well, okay, well then we have to figure out we can't drive a 2-ton vehicle and text. But what I was interested in is, what happens when things get too complicated for this brain that we have at this particular point in time? And it turns out that there are 3 symptoms which wind up occurring. We can document these. We know that these 3 symptoms occur in every organization, every company, and every civilization prior to their decline. So now that we know about them, we can watch for them. The first thing that happens is we become gridlocked. We know what our most dangerous threats are, what our problems are. We actually have solutions. We talk about the solutions, but we become unable to act. So our problems begin to exponentiate. They get larger and larger as they move from one generation or one department or one leader to another. Every civilization and organization reaches a cognitive threshold, a threshold at which the brains we have in our heads are not designed to deal with those kinds of problems anymore. And there's a simple explanation. Progress begins to move very quickly, as in we generate as much data from the dawn of humankind to year 2003 in 2 days, and the slow pace of evolution. It takes a long time to develop new cognitive capabilities. So this uneven rate of change between biology and complexity causes a gap to occur. Now, you probably forgot the last course in evolution or biology that you took in high school. I don't blame you. I forgot a lot of classes that I took in high school and college. I've kind of put them behind me. But now I'm going to ask you to remember that the last milestone in cognition occurred when we stood upright. Suddenly we could see our enemies from very, very far away. We could smell them, but we didn't know what to do to our survival advantage because we didn't have the calculator. The calculator is the frontal cortex. It's situated right here in the front of your head, and it's the CEO of your brain. It's the one that makes the analytical decisions on talent acquisition, for example. But suddenly as the CEO, as this frontal cortex began developing, our brow ridge got taller and taller. You know, when you go to a natural history museum, you notice that their foreheads are really low. It's because they didn't have a frontal cortex at that time. But it took about 4 to 5 million years for that frontal cortex to develop. And in evolutionary time, that's lickety-split. That's what we call fast evolution. And the reason that that developed is for our survival benefit. When organizations are young, and problems are simple, we can use our left and our right sides of our brains that have developed to this point of time and our available skill sets to solve problems. But over time, the problems become unwieldy. Look at all those charts that I put up. Are you kidding me? It would take days to even follow one arrow all the way through that chart. And eventually, by the way, I love this definition of complexity. Let me warn you, never buy a book about complexity. It's too complex to read. It's not an interesting field. It's horrible. Your head will want to explode. But here's what I will tell you. The definition of complexity that you should be operating on is the simplest definition. And that definition is, in a complex environment, there are simply more wrong choices than there are right ones. And the number of wrong ones is growing very, very fast, exponentially. So we enter what we call a high failure rate environment. It means you are apt to make more wrong picks than right picks, no matter what you do. Now, that sounds pretty depressing. Hey, we're here to make better picks. You will make some better picks, but not the way you're doing things today. Because in a high failure rate environment, there are more wrong options than right ones. Here's a good example. Our tax code has gone from 504 pages to 74,000 pages. If you self-file, you're an idiot. Who would do that? In an environment where you're up against 75,000 pages of tax code, it sets up an environment where General Electric can legally pay no taxes, and the person on the street who self-files pays the maximum taxes. That's how complexity works. Credit card contracts, I crisscross the country talking about complexity, and I've yet to run across a person who's read the 20,000 words that came with each credit card. How long does it take to read 20,000 words? And by the way, I don't know if there are cheesecake factories out here, but I will tell you that there are over 240 items on the menu. I count a lot of things. I'm really annoying to go out with because I'll say, hey, let's count those and see how many of those are. Complexity makes facts and knowledge very difficult to acquire. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, what you're really up against is looking for one needle in a stack of needles. And when complexity makes knowledge difficult to attain, we have a habit as a human organism of substituting knowledge, empirically based decisions, with beliefs. Dr. Oz goes on TV and he says, hey, eat a bunch of raspberry ketones and you'll lose 20 pounds. And there's a mad rush to the drugstore and we're all consuming as many raspberry ketones as we can. We have beliefs about stem cell research. We have 1.5 billion readings of the Earth's surface temperature right now, and 65% of Americans do not believe that any significant climate change is going on. We have beliefs about a lot of things. When I'm talking about beliefs, I'm not talking about religious beliefs. I'm talking about beliefs that are large and small. When you see the light turn green, you think it's okay to cross the street. And in fact, I just came from New York. They don't wait till the light turns green. They start moving about the time that the light is going to change. The neat thing about beliefs is that they're cognitively inexpensive. By that I mean you just believe something or you don't. You're done. But to prove something, that is a very cognitively taxing exercise. And so we prefer to believe than know. This is the human condition at this particular point in time. Now, the human organism requires both beliefs and knowledge in order to progress. But we never let that get in our way. For example, bloodletting. We bloodlet for 200 years, despite the fact that the patients were dying. But we didn't let that evidence get in our way. And by the way, I have a lot of scientists in the scientific community who say to me, well, Rebecca, we're not driven by beliefs. You know, we're scientists. We're data-based. And I said, well, what do you call a hypothesis or a theory? That's a belief. And we now know that all civilizations and all organizations do very well in a period in which they accommodate both beliefs, unproven, theoretical, creative ideas, and also make decisions based on empirical data. But there comes a time when things become too complex, and beliefs begin to dominate, and knowledge takes a back seat, and we become susceptible to unproven claims and false prophets. Does anybody know who this fellow is on the left? Or on the right? Bernie Madoff? It's interesting that the people that handed their money over to Bernie Madoff, those were not unsophisticated investors. Those are people who had been in the market for a very, very long time. What would cause someone like Steven Spielberg to give hundreds of millions of dollars to Bernie Madoff? Very simple. Bernie Madoff comes along and he says, look, it's too complicated for me to explain. Are you happy with your return? Yes, okay, don't ask me to explain it. And so we do become susceptible. And so the third stage then comes about. Gridlock, a confusion between facts and beliefs, a substitution of beliefs for facts, and then decisions and policies become based on unproven beliefs. I like to use the Mayans as a good example because anytime I use a current example, somebody says I'm a Republican or a Democrat. Seems these days you can't talk about any kind of current social issue without being pegged as a political mouthpiece. So I think it's safe to talk about the Mayans. It's been a while since they've been around. They were around for 3,000 years, and I want to show you how these principles played out during that 3,000 years. During the first couple of thousand years, they knew they had a very tenuous relationship with rainfall. They knew if it didn't rain, that their civilization would collapse. So what did they do? Most people go down to look at the big Mayan ruins, the big temples. No, really what you should look at is their massive reservoirs. They were unprecedented hydraulic engineers for their time. They built underground cisterns to store water so it wouldn't evaporate and to store food there during food shortages. In fact, that was the earliest and most primitive refrigeration systems. And it was very interesting that they practiced crop rotation and water conservation and rationing. And at the same time, they practiced fetishism. They sacrificed captured slaves so that the rains would come back. There was an accommodation for man-made remedy and also unproven beliefs. But you see that as the drought conditions get worse, they stop building reservoirs. No more saving water in cisterns, no more water rationing. In fact, what they do is they begin to shift toward more and more human sacrifice to bring the rains back. At first, they're sacrificing more captured slaves. Then they move on to the old and the infirm. Then they move on to young virgins. And just before the collapse of the Mayan Empire, you see no evidence of any man-made cures, but instead they decide to murder newborn infants that are unspoiled as a cure to the drought. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, we're not doing that, Rebecca. I mean, how can you use that as an example? No, but we have human beings who believe that flying planes into buildings is some, logical cure for what ails us today. So we're trapped in a reoccurring spiral. The first sign that complexity is outpacing our cognitive abilities is gridlock. The second is a confusion between beliefs and knowledge. And the third is that our policy inside our companies becomes highly irrational. And you've heard HIPPO. It becomes relegated to the highest paid opinion in the room, right? And then decline and collapse ensue. As Dr. Edward Wilson, who just celebrated his 85th birthday here at Harvard University, says, we live in a time when we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. You think we have a problem? But a cognitive threshold isn't our only evolutionary obstacle, and you know this better than I do. We're not born blank slates. A while back, somebody floated this idea, and we all bought into it, that we were born into this world of blank slate, and our teacher wrote on the slate, and our parents wrote on the slate, and our friends wrote on the slate, and then that's who we miraculously became. But we somehow forgot all of the evolutionary attributes that we brought with us. For example, I like to use myself as a good test case. For example, I am the descendant of a group of organisms that were very good at identifying and consuming high calories. They were high-calorie identifying organisms. And the reason I know that is because I am an educated woman, and there's no reason I should ever put a glazed donut in my mouth again. But if you have a buffet out and you have some carrots and some healthy choices and you have glazed donuts, my hand is going for the glazed donuts. And I wondered about this. I fought weight issues all my life, and I wondered, what is wrong with me? I have to get on a treadmill for 3 hours. It's not worth it. I know all this logically, and I was wondering why I was doing it. And there's a simple explanation for obesity. In nature, calories are very hard to come by. In fact, in locations where those calories were very scarce, where food was scarce, my troop, right, I am the descendant of earlier people. The people that I descended from, they were able to identify calories, consume them, and the people who ate carrot sticks and celery, their DNA isn't in the room today. They didn't make it. I made it because that was an asset, right? So and the other thing I've discovered about myself is that I don't like to move around a lot and waste those calories. Unless I have to go find more calories or fight someone, right? And apparently I'm not the only person. See, these are more of my troop. What you don't see is that that they're waiting in their cars and burning fossil fuels for 15 minutes to get a parking place closer to the escalator to get in to work out. Territoriality, for example. Recently, I had a CEO of a very large Silicon Valley company come up and say, Rebecca, I understand you're trying to point out that we have some biological issues that we are dealing with in business all the time, but I don't really do that. I'm a data-driven guy. And I thought, how can I get him to connect with his biology and some of the obstacles that he might be facing? And so I thought of something, and I said to him, do you shop in the grocery store? And he said, yeah. And I said, listen, let me do you a big favor. I don't want you going up and down the aisles and wasting all that time, filling your cart up. The next time you go to the grocery store, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get a cart and go straight to the checkout stand where everybody's in line to pay for their food and just shop out of their carts. He said, what? I said, shop out of their carts. They have everything you want. Bread, milk, cereal, they have it. And he said, I can't do that. And I said, why? They haven't paid for it. It's not theirs. Belongs to the store. What are they going to do if you shop out of other people's carts? He says, well, they'll get mad. They'll call the manager over. And I said, well, what can he do? They haven't paid for it. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the store. So just go to the checkout and shop out of other people's carts. He says, I'm not going to do it. And I said, now why? And I said, the reason is because when we go to a grocery store and we put stuff in our cart, and you know this, if somebody came over and started taking stuff out of your cart, there'd be fisticuffs. You haven't paid for it. You have no right to it. But you know exactly what would happen. And that's because in earlier times and today, your territory has all the things you need for you to survive, for a troop to survive, all the water and food. And so you have to fight to the death to protect that territory. In modern times, that's translated. Now it's a grocery cart with food that you don't even own. And you'll fight to the death for that. So if there's a big gap between rapid progress and slow evolution, then how do we break the cycle? Now remember the definition of complexity. More wrong choices than right ones. So what do we have that will help us toward empirically based decisions so we don't succumb to the lower instruments of our genetic inheritance? What do I have that will help me not eat a glazed donut? What do I have that will help me to make better decisions? And these are 5 technologies which I will assert to you today will have the biggest impact on talent acquisition and retention. The first is big data analytics. You heard some about that from IBM, from Rob, about the Watson system. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Mobile and distance applications tied to big data. Big data alone isn't going to cut it. You've got to simplify and distribute the use of that information by tying Go Anywhere mobile apps to that big data infrastructure on the back end. Number 3, social media and crowdsourcing. Number 4, something you might not be thinking about, surveillance and facial recognition. I'm going to spend a little extra time on that. And 5, I know, is not on anybody's radar right now, and that is nanobots. How many people are planning for nanobots? Raise your hand. Thought so. So we're in for a big shock. By the way, this next section, you're either going to feel like you want to run out of the room screaming, or you're going to be writing as fast as your hand will go. So big data analytics. It allows you to evaluate a broader range of attributes. We are moving toward computer-assisted decision-making, which will reduce the demand for experts and specialists. There are jobs you cannot fill right now because you're looking for very, very qualified experts and specialists. But I'm going to give you an example of why big data analytics is going to level the playing field, and it's not going to matter who does the job. Once you move to computer-assisted decision-making, the need for expertise diminishes. That's the way it works. Objective performance evaluations. We're not going to be having people sit down anymore and say, all right, do you think that you showed up at meetings and contributed? We're not going to have these vague kinds of questions anymore. We'll be having hundreds of metrics on which an employee can be evaluated. And we can take advantage for the first time of historical trends and make much more accurate future forecasts on whether an employee is going to stay and where they might wind up in the arc of their entire career with the company. And we're getting to be very, very accurate predictors at this. Now let me give you an example of what I mean. There is a Watson system at Sloan Kettering Hospital. It's in the ER department. And prior to it going into the ER department, if you were rushed in there, mission critical situation, time sensitive, we don't know anything about you, you're rushed in as a patient, it made a big difference as to whether the top surgeon in the hospital greeted you or the lowliest, least experienced, least knowledgeable person took you in. That made the difference between life and death. But now with the Watson system, what happens is it doesn't matter who takes you in. They go over to the Watson system and they put everything that is known about you as a patient. And within picoseconds, Watson comes back and says, the patient, it's 98% probable the patient has this, 46% that they have this disease, 23%. But here's the cool thing that Watson does, and it gives you pointers. It comes back and it says, but if you got me this data and this data, I could increase my diagnosis by 36%. So it will take the person who is least experienced, survey the entire universe of medical data, bring that to bear on that patient within picoseconds, and then say, go get this next piece of data next. This is what I need next to save this person's life. That's what big data does. It does what our brains can never do. It is absolutely impossible to leave that to a human being. And we talk about historical trends and accurate future forecasts. Imagine taking all that data in now and analyzing what your needs are and staffing needs for an ER, right? Because now you're not looking for the most qualified surgeon anymore. You're looking for someone who can use Watson and respond to Watson and adapt quickly. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about looking for a needle in a stack of needles. We want that one piece of data that will make a difference in a decision. And so what we've done is, in the blink of an eye, we've moved from the information age, where we've created all these things that will create more data, and we've now moved to computer-aided decision making. And everything that goes on inside a company has to move in that direction. According to IDC, the largest growth area, these third platform technologies, are going to be the big boom in IT. Data spending, big data spending will be up to $14 billion in 2014. And here's a couple of other statistics about big data. I'm not going to go too much into big data right now because I know that there's other presenters that will be going a little bit deeper into big data applications and why they're so significant. But if you don't have a big data project in your company right now, you're already behind. Now, I will argue that having that big data capability doesn't mean anything if you can't put it on a mobile app where I can now put in my characteristics. Let's say my child is sick and I want to know whether to bring him to the hospital or not. I'd like that tied to a big data system that says, by the way, if you could check the amount of perspiration on their forehead. Are they sweaty? Aren't they? I don't even necessarily know the information to put in when I go see a doctor. I mean, I'm aware that there's so much information that's being connected that I don't know what to tell my physician anymore. I don't know if you're like me, but I go in and I say, well, I have a little bit of a pimple here, and I have a headache, and I cut myself here, and I sound like a crazy person because I'm trying to load him up with data so he can give me a good diagnosis, because we don't really know what's related. And so a mother calling in to a doctor might not know the right questions to ask. And so that's why I think giving a series of questions, easy to answer questions in a hierarchical format is very, very important. There are going to be other people talking to you about social media and crowdsourcing, and I only have 11 minutes and 5 seconds left. They've got a counter up here, so I'm going to skip over this just slightly. But I am going to talk about surveillance for a moment. Surveillance is a very important tool in talent recruitment because we're moving toward facial recognition software. If you don't have a project on this, you need to be working on this right now. We express pain, pleasure, stress, lying through our face. That's how we do it. And I have seen applications recently where people were doing interviews over Skype using facial recognition software and asking people about specific things on their resume, and the facial recognition software was indicating the amount of truth-telling that was going on, when the person was stressed, when they were lying, measuring dilation of their eyes, perspiration, all kinds of body language. That's what facial, and you want this during performance reviews. You want this when you're doing some kind of investigation. You really want to be able to do that. In addition to surveillance information, how much surveillance should you do? How deep should you go? Are you going to be looking at someone's genetic history? Their predisposition to get breast cancer at a young age? Is that going to factor into your hiring? I don't know. Where does it stop? These are good questions, and I think they do need to be addressed because we're getting better and better at knowing what all this information is. Again, you're going to have facial recognition. I'm going to tell you just one quick application for facial recognition. I saw this being used at a hospital where they had a camera on a patient 24 hours, 24/7, and because we express pain through our face, when the patient looked like their pain medication was running out and they were starting to exhibit the earliest signs of discomfort in their face, it rang the nurse's station to administer pain medication to the patient before the patient had to ring that annoying buzzer and say, hey, help me here, I want to scratch my face off, right? So that's going to be being installed into hospitals very, very shortly. Lastly, nanobots. Now, I'm privy to a lot of new scientific innovation. I think you heard earlier, I'm from Silicon Valley. We have now reduced robots, nanobots, to the size of a human cell. What does that mean? It means a lot in the type of talent you'll be recruiting. When you think about it, we won't be ingesting pharmaceuticals anymore to cure disease. We'll be ingesting a nanobot that has algorithms and is programmed to eliminate bacteria, to eliminate cancer, to eliminate plaque that leads to Alzheimer's. We're already in animal trials injecting Norwegian rats with nanobots. So all these chemical engineers that you need for pharmaceutical, no. Maybe you ought to be recruiting robots. Watch Google. Google has launched the most aggressive robotic program in the world right now. They hired Ray Kurzweil. They bought Boston Robotics. They're on a buying spree of robots because they know that is where decision-making is going. We will program these miniature robots. I'm going to talk to you about this in just a moment because when you see the work that they can do, it is absolutely amazing. In fact, we're working on a trial program right now where instead of spraying pesticides over fields, agricultural fields, what we're spraying now is nanobots. And the plant ingests the nanobot, and the nanobot communicates with the watering system and tells the watering system exactly how much water that specific plant needs and doesn't need, preventing overwatering altogether. So let me talk to you about Dole Fresh Foods, which is the largest food producer in the world. They're a company that I work with, and we've incorporated all 5 of these technologies now to help us move away from belief-based decisions to empirical knowledge and fact-based decisions. One of the things that we did very, very early on is we realized NASA has the most sophisticated meteorological database in the entire world. We've never had this before. So we've now tied that to big data systems at Dole, tied to mobile applications, so that a farmer out in Brazil can say, hey, I had a 2% humidity change at the top of my hill where I'm growing fruits. From the bottom of my hill, what should I do? And what comes back to him is start a 1% calcium drip so that your fruit won't be so soft that it'll be damaged on the way to the grocery store. It gives him an immediate answer off of a mobile phone. More importantly, he could check the weather forecast to see when rain is coming and cut back on the amount of rain, the amount of water that he's using to grow his crops. And as you know, in the state of California, we have a massive drought going on. Since Dole has implemented this, they have reduced all of their watering, and I'm talking about within the last year, by 8%. simply by tapping into the NASA meteorological data. That's what big data systems do tied to mobile apps. In terms of nanobots, think about pesticides being eliminated and all foods being organic. I was just speaking at the Kansas Health Symposium, and the former chairman of the FDA was there. And I said, what's the FDA's position on ingesting nanobots? Because remember, they'll expire. They're smaller than a cell. You eat more dirt than that with your vegetables. Sorry to inform you, but it's true. And I said, well, what's our position with that? And he says, we don't have a position. And I said, oh, well, they better start looking at it, because that's what we'll wind up doing. By the way, the nanobots will deliver exactly the amount of nutrients to that plant that it needs to produce the highest yield. So food prices will come down, food will be cleaner, and so on and so forth. Now, Dole happens to have, by the way, I want to add, the biggest recruitment and talent acquisition issues that you could have, because they're trying to recruit laborers in the fields that are seasonal, all the way and up to microbiologists. And when crops are ready to be picked, everybody wants the same labor pool. So they're fighting on both ends to fill those jobs. And so these technologies have helped them quite a bit. I'm going to roll through one other thing that should be on your radar. And if it's not, I hope it will be when we're done here today. You are living in the golden age of neuroscience. Previously, as you know, we developed the left and right brain to solve all of our complex problems. But recently, if you think about it, in the whole arc of human history, we haven't been able to put a skull cap on and see what your brain was doing when it had to solve something that was too complicated. But now we can. And what we've discovered is that these aha moments where you come up with a solution out of thin air, these are not folklore. We kind of made them into folklore, where the apple fell on Newton's head and he discovered gravity, or Archimedes sat in the tub and water flowed over and he discovered displacement theory. But oh no, everybody has them. What we have discovered is that insight is this spontaneous connection of two pieces of data that you have in your brain in a way that you've never connected it before. And these are some of the medical information. I'm going to skip over that. But one of the things that you know is that in science, if you can predict an event's going to happen, and it does happen, and you can do that over and over again, you're really onto something. We can now predict when you're going to have an insight, when you're going to solve a problem that is more complicated than your left and right brain can handle. A small part of your brain called the ASTG lights up like a Christmas tree. And we say, they're going to get the answer right, and you do. So we're now working as much as we can on mapping the human brain. This is the first time in human history that the President of the United States has allocated money to map the human brain. And you know what an effect mapping the human genome had on medicine. Mapping the human brain is going on right now, and you should be incorporating as much of that neuroscientific information and technology into looking at how people handle stress, how they make decisions. There are probably clinics near you where you can actually subcontract to them and say, well, how does this person's brain respond to certain types of decisions, and create those algorithms as well. So in order to keep on time, I'm on time. I've got 1 minute, 11 seconds to go. I want to point out that you are dealing in a fast-changing environment. The number they surveyed about 100 major corporations and asked the HR departments what is their number one challenge in 2014 and 2015. And the number one answer by far was change management. That was the number one answer. So why? More data, more people, more ways. If you think about it, the top attributes of high-performing talent and companies right now are fast adaptation, how quickly can they manage change, a mix of empirically based and belief-based policy. Look, if there's no data, you still have to make a decision and move forward. But what you want is people who understand that they're making that decision based on very little data or no data at all, so that they're open to it when the information comes. A fast failing culture is good. Fail fast. You can't avoid it in a high failure rate environment. So you might as well incorporate it, just as venture capitalists do. And I don't have time to go through the venture capital model, but maybe we'll do that over lunchtime. Diversification and redundancy. You know not to bet on one stock on Wall Street. You go to see a financial advisor and he tells you buy bonds, buy stocks, invest in real estate. The same thing should be true for your HR strategy. Don't bet on one strategy. Have multiple contingencies available because you are dealing with a high failure rate environment. And last of all, turn your organization into a predictive, preemptive organization, not one that is reacting, not one that is trying to catch up. The highest instrument of our genetic inheritance is not opposable thumbs. It is not standing upright. It is our ability to understand tomorrow. No other animal, no other organism on Earth can conceive of what could occur tomorrow. And we've now extended that out to next week, next year, 10 years from now. That is the true human legacy, and we see it not being used as much as we should use it inside of our companies. So you face a big challenge. A talent shortage since 2007, 50% of employers reporting that those shortages are going to affect their competitiveness, and half of all employers are turning to alternative practices. I would leave you with this one thing. The best movie ever on talent acquisition and adapting to a fast-changing environment is Moneyball. How many people have seen Moneyball? Best movie. Have everyone on your executive teams watch that movie, because you want to talk about the difference between belief-based talent acquisition and empirically based talent acquisition, and the cultural revolution that causes in an industry. Well, Moneyball says it better than I can. I will be around to answer questions, and I thank you so much for being here and being engaged. I really appreciate you attending the conference, and I'll be here to answer questions, and thank you.